Commander Ethrin had come to believe that the edge of human space was the quietest assignment in the entire Dominion. Not peaceful, not safe, just empty. There was a difference, and after 4 months stationed along the Terran quarantine boundary, he understood it intimately. The patrol route circled a modest yellow star catalogued as insignificant. One inhabited world, one small satellite, a scattering of debris and primitive orbital constructs that had not changed in decades. The official report described it all in precise, dismissive language. Carbon-based life forms, internally aggressive, technologically limited, no faster-than-light capability, no strategic value. The kind of civilization that barely warranted a footnote. 80 years ago, a survey vessel had arrived, observed, recorded, and departed. The conclusion had been simple. No threat. Monitoring interval, 200 years. The Dominion had not even bothered to send a proper station. Just 2 frigates rotating every 4 months, watching nothing happen. Ethrin's ship, the Vigilant Mercy, was one of them. It floated now at the outer edge of the designated boundary, its hull aligned with the quiet drift of the system's distant debris field. The stars beyond stretched endlessly, cold and indifferent, while the Terran star burned faintly behind them like a forgotten ember. Inside the command chamber, everything was exactly as it had been the day before, and the day before that, and the day before that. Routine defined every motion. Sensor sweeps every 40 minutes. Log entries every 2 hours. Status reports transmitted at fixed intervals regardless of content. Most reports consisted of the same sentence repeated with minor variations. No activity detected. Lieutenant Saran, the sensor officer, didn't even look up as she spoke. Boundary sweep complete. No anomalies. Her voice carried the practiced neutrality of someone who had said the same words too many times to assign them meaning. Ethrin nodded without turning. Log it. The command display reflected off the curved surface of the viewport, casting faint lines of data across the stars outside. He watched those stars more often than he watched his crew. They didn't change. They didn't require interpretation. They simply existed. Predictable. Reliable. Unlike people. How long until rotation? Saran asked. 11 days, Ethrin replied. She exhaled softly, not quite relief, not quite impatience. Feels longer. It always does at the end. Silence settled again, thick but familiar. Not uncomfortable, just present. Across the chamber, Analyst Prell sat in his station reviewing archived data streams from the Terran planet below. Atmospheric composition trends. Industrial output indicators. Signal noise patterns from surface transmissions. None of it was classified as important. But someone, somewhere in the Dominion hierarchy, had decided that embedding an analyst on a patrol frigate might increase efficiency. Real-time interpretation instead of delayed review. Prell had not agreed with the decision. He belonged in controlled environments. Data centers. Archives. Places where information stayed where it was supposed to be. Not here. Not on the edge of nothing. He adjusted the display in front of him, isolating a decades-long trend in atmospheric pollutants. Industrial gas levels increasing steadily, he said, mostly to himself. Consistent with early-stage technological development. Ethrin glanced in his direction. Anything unusual? No, Prell replied. Exactly what the model predicts. Which, in its own way, was the most reassuring outcome possible. Predictability meant stability. Stability meant irrelevance. And irrelevance meant safety. The Terrans had not changed in any meaningful way since the original survey. Their transmissions still filled the void with chaotic mixtures of music, conflict reports, and something called competitive sport. Their orbital presence remained limited to small constructs that posed no threat to anything beyond their immediate environment. They were contained. Ethrin leaned back slightly in the command chair, letting the quiet settle into him. This was the job. Not exploration. Not combat. Not diplomacy. Observation. Endless, uneventful observation. The Dominion managed 14,000 member species. Entire sectors filled with active trade routes, contested borders, emerging powers, and collapsing civilizations. Compared to that, this assignment was almost insulting. Watching a world that didn't matter. A world that couldn't matter. A world that had been measured, categorized, and dismissed. Commander, Saran said after a moment, her tone casual. Do you think they'll ever make it out here? Ethrin considered the question, Not because it required deep thought, but because it broke the monotony. No, he said. Not ever. Not within the monitoring interval. She nodded, accepting that answer without challenge. 200 years. A number large enough to remove urgency. Large enough to justify inaction. Large enough to forget. Prell looked up from his station, curiosity flickering across his expression. Their development curve is accelerating, he said. Slowly, but consistently. Ethrin gave a small, almost dismissive shrug. Acceleration from near zero is still near zero. Prell hesitated, then nodded. Yes, statistically, that's correct. The conversation faded as quickly as it had begun. Outside, the stars remained unchanged. Inside, the systems continued their quiet cycles. Everything was functioning exactly as expected, exactly as predicted, exactly as it had for months. Ethrin allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. There was comfort in this kind of assignment. No surprises, no sudden crises, no decisions that carried weight beyond routine procedure. Just time. Time measured in identical cycles. Time that passed without consequence. Time that meant nothing was wrong. He reached for the next maintenance log, already knowing what it would say before he read it. No deviations, no irregularities, no events of note. The Dominion had drawn a boundary around this system and declared it insignificant. And for 80 years, the universe had agreed. Nothing happened here. That was the entire point. And for a very long time, that had been true. It started as something so small that it didn't deserve attention, which was why it almost went unnoticed. The first anomaly appeared during a routine boundary sweep, buried beneath layers of expected data, filtered automatically by systems designed to ignore anything that did not meet specific thresholds of concern. Lieutenant Saran saw it anyway, not because it was obvious, because it was wrong, not in a way she could immediately define. Not a spike, not a signal, not even a proper reading. Just a subtle inconsistency in the return pattern, like a line of text written slightly out of alignment. She frowned at her display, ran the sweep again. "Commander," she said, slower this time. "I'm getting an irregularity." Ethrin didn't turn immediately. What kind of irregularity? I'm not sure yet. That alone was enough to shift the atmosphere in the room. Uncertainty didn't belong here. "Clarify," he said. Saran adjusted the scan parameters, narrowing the focus of the sensor array. Data streamed across her console in tight, controlled sequences. "It's not a contact," she said. "No defined mass, no emission signature, no velocity vector." "Then what is it?" She hesitated. "That's the problem. The system keeps trying to resolve it, and failing." Ethrin stood, crossed the distance between them in a few measured steps. "Show me." She brought the data forward onto the main display. At first glance, it looked like nothing. Just the usual starfield mapping, clean and stable, each point of light cataloged and accounted for. Then Ethrin saw it. A distortion, not visible in the stars themselves, but in the space between them. A faint irregularity where the mapping grid bent slightly, as if something had nudged it out of place. "That's a sensor artifact," he said automatically. "I thought so too," Saran replied. "I ran a diagnostic. And no faults detected. Run it again." She did. The system responded instantly. All systems nominal. The distortion remained. Ethrin stared at it for a moment longer than he intended. "How long has it been there?" "I don't know," Saran admitted. "It wasn't flagged. I only noticed it because I was watching the raw feed." Prell had already left his station. He moved closer, eyes narrowing as he studied the display. "Expand the resolution," he said. Saran complied, increasing the magnification. The distortion grew clearer, not sharper, but more defined in its inconsistency. It wasn't random. That was the first problem. Random errors had patterns of their own: noise, fluctuation, instability. This didn't behave like that. It was stable, consistently wrong. Prell leaned in slightly. "Run a comparative overlay with previous sweeps." Saran pulled up archived data, layering it over the current scan. For a moment, nothing changed. Then she adjusted the alignment. And the distortion didn't match. It wasn't there before. Ethrin felt something shift in the back of his mind. Small, uncomfortable. "When did it appear?" he asked. "I'm checking," Saran said. Her hands moved faster now, cycling through recent scans. "Last sweep, no anomaly. Current sweep, present. So it appeared within the last 40 minutes. "Yes." Silence settled again, But this time it wasn't familiar. It was focused. Prel straightened slightly. Run a gravitational analysis. Saran glanced at Ethrin. He gave a single nod. Do it. The system recalibrated, shifting from passive observation to deeper analysis. Data streams adjusted, recalculating mass distributions across the scanned region. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the results came in. Saran's expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough. What is it? Ethrin asked. She didn't answer immediately. I'm getting a mass reading. Ethrin's gaze sharpened. That's not possible. I know. Then the reading is incorrect. I ran the calculation twice. Run it again. She did. The number didn't change. Ethrin looked at the display, then looked again. The value was wrong. Not slightly. Completely. It didn't correspond to anything that should exist within that section of space. No known object. No debris field. No stellar fragment. Nothing. What are we looking at? He asked quietly. Saran shook her head. I don't know. Prel stepped closer, his voice more controlled than his posture. Overlay visual. Saran hesitated for a fraction of a second, then activated the command. The main viewport display adjusted, aligning with the sensor coordinates. The stars shifted slightly as the system recalibrated perspective. Everything looked the same. Exactly the same. Except, Ethrin felt it before he fully saw it. A subtle absence. Not darkness. Not shadow. Just less. A section of the starfield where something didn't quite align. Where the density of light felt interrupted. That area, Prel said quietly. Magnify. Saran increased the zoom. The distortion expanded across the screen. It still wasn't clear. Still not defined. But now it was undeniable. Something was there. Not emitting. Not reflecting. Just affecting. Ethrin's voice lowered. Explain it. Saran swallowed slightly. It's behaving like a gravitational displacement. From what? I don't know. Prel's eyes remained fixed on the display. It's not behaving like a natural object. Ethrin looked at him. Meaning? Prel took a breath. Meaning it's too stable. Too precise. The word hung there. Precise. As if whatever they were seeing wasn't random. Wasn't accidental. Wasn't natural. Ethrin turned back to the display. The distortion hadn't moved. Hadn't changed. It simply existed. Exactly where it had appeared. Exactly as it had appeared. What's its velocity? He asked. Saran checked. 0. Relative drift? None. So it appeared there and stopped. Yes. The room felt smaller suddenly. Not physically, but in the way attention compresses space. Prel spoke again, quieter now. Commander, I recommend we flag this as a priority anomaly. Ethrin didn't respond immediately. He had spent 19 years in the Dominion Patrol Service. He had seen sensor ghosts, calibration errors, spatial distortions caused by natural phenomena. Every unusual reading eventually resolved into something explainable, something known, something safe. He told himself this would be the same. It had to be. File the anomaly report, he said finally. Preliminary classification? He hesitated for just a moment. Then, sensor irregularity pending verification. Saran nodded and began compiling the report. Prel didn't move. He was still watching the display. Still watching the place where something had appeared out of nothing. And remained. Ethrin followed his gaze. The distortion sat quietly in the starfield. Unmoving. Unchanging. As if it had always been there. As if the only thing that had changed was their ability to see it. The distortion did not move. That was the first thing that began to feel wrong in a way Ethrin could no longer ignore. Anomalies drifted. Debris shifted. Even gravitational irregularities evolved over time as surrounding forces interacted with them. This did neither. It simply remained. Exactly where it had appeared. Exactly as it had appeared. For 12 minutes after the initial detection, nothing changed. And somehow, that made it worse. Run a full-spectrum sweep, Ethrin said. Saran nodded, already ahead of him. The sensor array expanded its range, shifting into deeper analysis modes. Frequencies layered over one another, probing for emissions, reflections, heat signatures, anything that could define what they were looking at. The results came back empty. No radiation spike. No thermal variation. No signal output. Nothing. Prel's voice was quieter now, more focused. It's not emitting because it doesn't need to. Ethrin glanced at him. Explain. Prel didn't look away from the display. Whatever it is, it's not interacting with us the way normal objects do. It's not giving us data. Saran exhaled slowly. Then how are we detecting it at all? No one answered immediately, because the answer was already there. They weren't detecting the object. They were detecting its effect. Ethrin stepped closer to the main display, zoomed further. Saran hesitated. We're already at maximum optical magnification. Enhance contrast. She adjusted the visual filters. The starfield sharpened. Points of light intensified. And then, the absence became visible, not as darkness, but as interruption. A section of space where the stars simply stopped. Not dimmed, not obscured by shadow. Gone. As if something had been placed in front of them that did not reflect light, did not emit light, did not allow light through. Ethrin felt his breath slow. That's not a distortion, he said. Saran's voice was barely above a whisper. No, it isn't. Prell leaned forward slightly. That's an occultation. Ethrin turned to him. Say that again. Prell swallowed. It's blocking the background stars. Completely. The words settled heavily in the room. Blocking. Not bending. Not distorting. Blocking. Ethrin looked back at the display. The shape was still incomplete, still undefined, but now his mind began to fill in the edges. A boundary. A form. Something with mass. Something solid. How large, he asked. Saran pulled up the distance calculations. Her hand slowed. Commander. How large? She turned the display slightly so he could see the numbers. Ethrin stared at them. For a moment, his brain refused to process what they meant. Then it did, and he wished it hadn't. That's wrong, he said. I checked it 3 times. Check it again. She did. The number didn't change. Prell spoke, his voice controlled but strained at the edges. At that distance, for it to block that much of the stellar background. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Ethrin completed it in his own mind. It was too big. Not just large. Not just unusual. Impossible. No structure that size could exist without a detectable energy signature, Ethrin said. And yet, Prell replied quietly. It did. Ethrin stepped back slightly, forcing himself to think. Could it be a natural body? Saran shook her head immediately. No irregular rotation. No thermal variation. No debris interaction. It's not behaving like an asteroid or a rogue fragment. Then what is it behaving like? She hesitated. Then, like something that arrived and stopped. Silence followed that. Ethrin looked at the display again. The shape was clearer now, not because it had changed, but because his perception of it had. It had edges. Subtle. Defined not by light, but by the absence of it. A section of the universe cut away. Clean. Deliberate. How long has it been there, he asked. Saran checked the time markers. 23 minutes since first detection. And no movement. None. No signal. None. Ethrin felt something cold settle beneath his thoughts. Anything else? Saran hesitated again, then switched the display mode. Commander, look at this. The system overlaid gravitational mapping data across the visual field. Lines of influence. Curvature indicators. Mass distribution modeling. The distortion appeared again. But this time, it wasn't subtle. The space around the object was bending. Not violently. Not chaotically. But with a weight that was impossible to ignore. Prell stared at it. That's not residual gravity. Ethrin's voice tightened. Meaning? Prell turned slightly, his expression sharper now. Meaning whatever is there, it has mass consistent with something much denser than its apparent size. Ethrin looked back at the numbers, then at the shape, then back again. His mind tried to reconcile the two. Failed. Tried again. Failed again. That's not possible, he said. Prell didn't argue. Because it wasn't. And yet, Saran spoke quietly. Commander, there's more. Ethrin didn't look away from the display. Go on. She adjusted the scan once more, isolating the region around the object. I expanded the detection field, just to be sure we weren't missing anything. And her voice dropped slightly. There's nothing around it. Ethrin finally turned. What do you mean nothing? No debris. No radiation trail. No residual energy from transit. Prell's eyes narrowed. Transit. Saran nodded slowly. If something that large moved into position, there should be evidence. Disturbance. Displacement. Something. Ethrin felt the implication before she said it. There isn't, Saran finished. The words settled like weight. No trail. No approach vector. No sign of arrival. Ethrin looked back at the object. At the absence in the stars. At the shape that shouldn't exist. Then how did it get there, he asked. No one answered. Because the answer was worse than the question. It didn't look like something that had arrived. It looked like something that had always been there, waiting. The display flickered slightly as the system recalibrated again, trying, failing, to make sense of what it was seeing. Ethrin stared at it, longer now, long enough for a realization to begin forming. Slow, unwelcome. If it wasn't moving, if it wasn't emitting, if it hadn't just arrived, then maybe it wasn't supposed to be detected at all, and something had just changed that made it visible. The thought settled into his mind like a fracture spreading through glass. Behind him, Prell spoke again, very quietly. "Commander." Ethrin didn't respond. "Whatever that is." A pause. "It's not hiding." Ethrin's eyes remained fixed on the shape, on the missing stars, on the impossible scale of it. "No," he said finally. His voice was steady, but something underneath it had shifted. "It isn't." Because hiding implied intent, movement, reaction. This wasn't hiding. This was something else. Something far more unsettling. It wasn't trying to avoid being seen. It simply hadn't cared. Until now. And now that it could be seen, it did nothing. It didn't move. It didn't react. It didn't acknowledge them. It just remained. Massive. Silent. Present. Ethrin felt the weight of that presence settle into the room. Into the ship. Into himself. "Maintain observation distance," he said. "No active scans beyond passive range." Saran nodded quickly. Prell didn't move. Neither did Ethrin. They both continued to look at the same thing. The same impossible shape. The same section of space where the universe had been interrupted. And for the first time since his assignment began, the edge of human space no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. And whatever was occupying it was big enough to make the stars disappear. For a long time, no one spoke. The shape remained fixed on the display, unchanged, unresponsive, as if the concept of movement simply did not apply to it. Ethrin forced himself to sit, not because he wanted to, because standing made it feel closer. "Run deeper analysis," he said. "Everything we have." Saran nodded, her earlier calm replaced with careful precision. The system shifted again, pulling from secondary arrays, recalibrating long-range sensors, digging into layers of data that were rarely used on patrol assignments like this. Prell had already moved back to his station, not to distance himself, to think. His hands moved across the interface, pulling archived records, cross-referencing signatures, isolating variables. "If it's not emitting," he said, half to himself, "then we look at what it's affecting." Ethrin didn't respond. He understood the approach. When something refused to reveal itself directly, you studied the shadow it cast. "Gravitational profile stabilized," Saran reported. "Display it." The main screen shifted again. This time, the distortion wasn't subtle. Curvature lines bent sharply around the unseen mass, mapping out its influence across space. It wasn't a natural curve. It was structured, defined. Prell leaned forward. "That's too clean." Ethrin glanced at him. "Explain." "Natural mass distributions create irregular gravitational fields. Variations. Noise. This," he gestured toward the display, "is uniform. Uniform. Deliberate. Engineered." The word wasn't spoken. It didn't need to be. Ethrin felt the implication settle. "Continue analysis," he said. Prell shifted to another dataset. "Trying energy interaction next." "From what source?" "Background radiation. Stellar output. Anything that passes near it." The system processed the request. For several seconds, the display filled with layered readings. Then Prell froze. "Wait." Ethrin's attention snapped to him. "What is it?" Prell didn't answer immediately. He adjusted the scale, ran the comparison again, then again, each time slower, more deliberate. "What are you seeing?" Ethrin asked. Prell finally looked up, and for the first time since the anomaly appeared, he looked unsettled. "I need access to the contact archive," he said. Ethrin frowned. "Why?" "Because I've seen this before." The words landed harder than they should have. "That's not possible," Saran said. Prell didn't argue. He was already pulling up the request. "Commander." Ethrin hesitated. Then, "Granted." The archive opened. 80 years of stored data flooded the system. Survey logs. First contact recordings. Primitive scans from a time when the Terran system had barely registered as noteworthy. Prell moved through it with precision. Not searching randomly. Searching with purpose. "What exactly are you looking for?" Ethrin asked. Prell's voice was tight. "Drive signatures." Ethrin blinked. "Drive signatures?" "Yes." "From what?" Prell didn't look up. from them. The implication settled slowly. Then all at once. Humans, Saran said. Prell didn't answer. He had already found something. Here, he said. He pulled up an old file. The data was crude compared to modern standards. Low resolution, minimal detail. But it was enough. This is from the original survey, Prell said. One of their early deep space probes. The display split. On one side, the archived signature. Weak, primitive, barely measurable. On the other, the current anomaly data. Ethrin looked between them. At first, they didn't seem related. The scale was completely different. The intensity alone made comparison feel absurd. Then Prell adjusted the normalization, stripped away magnitude, left only pattern, and suddenly, they matched. Exactly. Saran inhaled sharply. That's... Yes, Prell said. Ethrin stared at the two readings. At the identical curves. The same frequency distribution. The same dispersion pattern at the edges. It was unmistakable. That's impossible, Ethrin said. Prell nodded once. I know. But it's scaled, Saran said, her voice tightening. That output. I've calculated it, Prell interrupted. He hesitated. Just for a second. Then, it's approximately 400 times greater. The number hung in the air. Heavy. Wrong. Ethrin looked back at the display. At the matching signatures. At the massive difference in scale. His mind tried to reconcile them. Failed. This doesn't make sense, he said. Prell's voice was quieter now. It does. Ethrin turned to him. No, it doesn't. You're telling me that. I'm telling you, Prell said carefully, that whatever is out there is using the same fundamental propulsion principles that the Terrans had 80 years ago. Ethrin stared at him. That's primitive technology. Yes. Barely capable of leaving their own system. Yes. Then how is it producing that level of output? Prell looked back at the display, at the two matching signatures, at the impossible scale between them. They didn't replace it, he said. Ethrin didn't understand. Replace what? The technology. Prell's voice steadied slightly as he spoke. They didn't abandon it for something more advanced. They didn't discover a new principle. They didn't leap forward the way most civilizations do. He gestured toward the display. They kept it. Saran's expression tightened. And improved it. Prell shook his head slowly. No. Ethrin felt something shift again. Then what? Prell finished the thought. They made it bigger. Silence. Ethrin looked back at the numbers. At the scale. At the object blocking out the stars. His mind began to connect the pieces. Slowly. Reluctantly. 80 years. That was all the time that had passed since the survey. 80 years since humanity had been classified as insignificant. 80 years since they had been dismissed as non-threatening. And in that time, they had taken primitive nuclear propulsion and multiplied it until it could power something that bent space. Saran whispered it before she could stop herself. That thing, her voice faltered, is human. No one corrected her, because the data didn't allow it. Ethrin felt his grip tighten on the edge of the command console. That can't be right, he said. But it wasn't conviction. It was resistance. Prell spoke again, carefully. The signature matches exactly. Not similar. Not derivative. Identical in structure. Ethrin shook his head slightly. No external influence. None that I can detect. No evidence of technological acquisition. No. Prell met his gaze. This is internal development. The words landed harder than anything else. Internal. Which meant they had done this themselves. No shortcuts. No outside assistance. No sudden leap from primitive to advanced. Just time, effort, and intent. Ethrin turned back to the display, to the shape that blocked the stars, to the gravitational field that bent around it, to the signature that connected it to something so small, so weak, so forgettable. Just 80 years ago. How big is it? He asked. Saran hesitated, then brought up the dimensional estimate. The number appeared on the screen. Ethrin looked at it, then looked again. His mind tried to reject it, tried to categorize it as error, tried to force it into something reasonable. It refused. That's in kilometers, he said slowly. Yes. That's the length. Yes. Silence followed. A long one. The kind that stretches when reality doesn't align with expectation. Ethrin felt something settle into place. Not understanding. Not acceptance. Something else. Something colder. We misclassified them, he said. No one disagreed. Because there was nothing left to argue. The data was clear. The signature was undeniable. The scale was impossible. And yet, it was there. Right in front of them, a human vessel, built from primitive technology, refined, expanded, scaled beyond reason, and sitting just inside the boundary of their space. Ethrin exhaled slowly. File a full contact report, he said. Saran moved immediately. Priority 1. Priority 1. Attach all sensor data. Yes, Commander. Prell didn't move. He was still staring at the display, at the comparison, at the impossible equation his mind was still trying to solve. Ethrin looked at the object one more time, at the silent, unmoving presence of it, at the sheer scale of what humanity had built without anyone noticing. And for the first time, he didn't see an anomaly. He saw intent. Because this wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't a natural phenomenon waiting to be explained. It was something that had been created, deliberately, carefully, over time, and then placed exactly where it was now, at the edge of human space, waiting, not hidden, not advancing, just there. Ethrin's voice was quieter now, more controlled. Has it made any attempt to communicate? Saran checked. No. No signal. No. No scan. No. Ethrin nodded slowly. Of course. It didn't need to. Because whatever was out there already knew exactly what it was doing. And whatever it was waiting for had nothing to do with them discovering it. It had always been meant to be seen. Eventually. And now that it had been, it simply remained. Silent. Massive. Unmistakably human. And far more dangerous than anyone had ever imagined. The ship did nothing. That was the part that unsettled them most. Not the size. Not the impossible scale of it. Not even the realization of its origin. It was the stillness. Hours passed. Not metaphorical hours. Not stretched perception. Measured time. Logged time. Real, unbroken hours in which nothing changed. The object remained exactly where it was. No movement. No signal. No reaction. Commander Ethrin had ordered continuous observation with strict limitations. No active scans beyond passive range. No approach. No attempt to provoke a response. At first, the order had felt cautious. Now, it felt necessary. Because the longer they watched, the more it became clear that whatever sat in front of them was not uncertain. It was not searching. It was not reacting. It was waiting. Status? Ethrin asked. Saran didn't look up. No change. How long since last variation? There hasn't been one. Ethrin glanced at the time marker. For hours. For hours of absolute consistency. Even anomalies fluctuated. This did not. Prell stood near the main display now, no longer pretending to return to his station. His data pad was in his hand, but he hadn't written anything for a long time. He was just watching. Any passive emissions? Ethrin asked. Saran shook her head. None. No energy leakage? No. No communication attempts? No. The answers came too easily. Too cleanly. Like reading from a script that never changed. Ethrin shifted slightly in his chair. Life signs. Saran hesitated. We can't confirm. Why not? The hull, whatever it's made of, it's blocking deeper scans. Prell spoke quietly. That's intentional. Ethrin didn't respond. Because he was already thinking the same thing. Nothing about this was accidental. Every absence of data was a choice. Gravitational fluctuation? He asked. Stable. Thermal drift. None detectable. Magnetic interference? Negative. Ethrin exhaled slowly. Everything about the object suggested control. Perfect control. It wasn't leaking energy. It wasn't adjusting position. It wasn't reacting to their presence. It was holding itself. Exactly as it was. Deliberately. Saran finally glanced back at him. Commander. He met her gaze. This doesn't feel like an arrival. Ethrin's expression didn't change. No. She hesitated. It feels like it's been here. The words settled into the room. Prell spoke without turning. Or it's been waiting to be noticed. Ethrin leaned forward slightly. For what? Prell didn't answer. Because none of them knew. Another hour passed. Then another. The crew rotated through their shifts, but no one truly disengaged. Even those assigned to rest found reasons to remain near the command deck. No one wanted to miss something. The problem was, there was nothing to miss. No change. No escalation. No signal. Just the same massive absence in the stars. Endless. Unmoving. Ethrin stood again and moved toward the viewport. The raw visual feed displayed the same thing it had since the beginning. Stars. And the place where stars were not. Up close, the effect was even more unsettling. It wasn't darkness. Darkness had depth. This had none. It was like looking at a section of reality that had been removed. Cleanly. Precisely. As if space itself had been cut away. "Commander," Saran said suddenly. Ethrin turned. "What is it?" "For a moment. I thought." She stopped. "Thought what?" She looked back at the display. "Nothing." Ethrin waited. Then, it looked like the edge shifted. Prell turned immediately. "Shifted how?" "I don't know. Just slightly." "Was it a sensor fluctuation?" "I checked. And no error." Ethrin stepped closer. "Show me." She replayed the last 30 seconds of visual data. The display looped. Again. 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 Nothing changed. The edge remained perfectly still. Prell frowned. "Play it slower." She did. Frame by frame. Each moment stretched. Each fraction of time examined. Still nothing. Saran exhaled. "I must have imagined it." Ethrin didn't respond right away. He was still watching the playback. Still studying the edge of the absence. Because for just a moment, he thought he saw it too. Not movement. Not exactly. Just the suggestion of something behind it. Something layered. Something deeper than the surface they were perceiving. Then it was gone. Or maybe it had never been there. "Continue observation," he said quietly. Saran nodded. Prell didn't look convinced. But he didn't argue. The hours continued. Time stretched. The ship remained. At some point, the silence itself became a presence. Not empty. Not passive. Something else. Something that pressed against thought. Because silence like this wasn't natural. Even in deep space. Even at the edge of forgotten systems. There was always something. Radiation. Drift. Noise. This had none. It was as if the object absorbed not just light, but activity. Possibility. Ethrin returned to his chair slowly. "Status report sent?" he asked. "Yes," Saran replied. Response. "None yet." Of course not. This wasn't the kind of situation that resolved quickly. Somewhere far from here, someone would read the report. Then read it again. Then decide whether to believe it. Ethrin leaned back slightly. And for the first time since the anomaly appeared, he felt something unfamiliar. Not confusion. Not disbelief. Not even fear. Something quieter. He looked at the object again. At the impossible scale. At the silence. At the complete lack of reaction. And a thought formed. Simple. Unavoidable. If something that powerful wanted to act, it already would have. Prell spoke softly, almost as if continuing that thought aloud. "It knows we're here." Ethrin didn't look at him. "Yes." "It detected us before we detected it." "Yes." "And it chose not to respond." Ethrin nodded once. "Yes." Prell's grip tightened slightly on his data pad. "Why?" Ethrin didn't answer. Because there were only two possibilities. Either it didn't consider them a threat, or it didn't consider them relevant. Neither option was comforting. Another long stretch of silence passed. Then, Saran inhaled sharply. "Commander." Ethrin turned immediately. "What is it?" Her eyes were fixed on the display. "There's a change." Prell stepped closer. "What kind of change?" Saran's voice dropped. "Light." Ethrin moved to her side. "Explain." She adjusted the visual filters. Enhanced contrast. Increased sensitivity. And then, they saw it. Faint. Subtle. But unmistakable. Along the surface of the absence. Points of light began to appear. Not random. Not scattered. Structured. Evenly spaced. Ethrin's pulse slowed. "What are those?" Prell answered. His voice was very quiet. "Running lights." The realization settled instantly. Not a phenomenon. Not an effect. A function. Ethrin stared at the display. At the pattern. At the deliberate activation. After hours of silence. After hours of nothing. It had done something. Not an attack. Not a maneuver. Not even a signal. Just light. Saran swallowed. "It's showing itself." Prell shook his head slightly. "No." Ethrin didn't look away. "Then what is it doing?" Prell's answer came after a moment. "It's letting us see it." The distinction mattered. More than either of them wanted to admit. Because showing implied intention. Letting implied permission. Ethrin felt that same cold realization settle again. This entire time, they hadn't been observing it. They had been allowed to observe it. And now, after hours of silence, after hours of waiting, it had decided to reveal just a little more. The lights remained steady, unblinking, controlled, and for the first time, the shape behind the absence began to take form. Not fully, not clearly, but enough. Enough to confirm what they already knew. This was no anomaly, no accident, no unknown phenomenon. This was a vessel, a human vessel, and it had been sitting there, watching them, the entire time. For a long moment, no one spoke. The lights remained steady across the surface of the vessel, evenly spaced, calm, deliberate. They did not pulse. They did not flash warnings or signals of aggression. They simply existed. Like markers. Like navigation. Ethrin felt the meaning settle into place before anyone said it out loud. This is standard, Prell said quietly. For vessels. Saran nodded slowly. Running lights. Identification markers. Ethrin's eyes remained fixed on the display. Not weapons. Not shields. Not a threat display. Identification. The realization shifted something fundamental in the room. This isn't a combat posture, Saran added. No, Prell said. It's the opposite. Ethrin turned slightly. Explain. Prell hesitated. Then, it's what you do when you expect to be seen. Silence followed, because that implied something far more unsettling than aggression. Expectation. This had not been a surprise to them. It had been a timeline. Ethrin looked back at the ship, at the scale of it, at the quiet, controlled activation of its lights. It hadn't reacted. It hadn't adjusted. It hadn't escalated. It had simply moved to the next step. Commander, Saran said, her voice tightening slightly. Incoming signal. Everything in the room shifted at once. Source. The object. Of course it was. Ethrin stepped forward. Put it through. Saran's hands moved quickly, routing the signal through the standard communication filters. Her expression changed as she read the initial data. It's formatted. Ethrin frowned. Formatted how? She looked up. Dominion diplomatic channel. That stopped everything. Prell blinked. That's not possible. Saran shook her head. It's not just the channel. It's using Keth standard. Ethrin's voice dropped. Display it. The message appeared on the main screen. Short. Clean. Precise. No distortion. No delay. Just 11 words. Ambassador vessel detected. Please specify preferred rendezvous coordinates. No one spoke. The words hung in the air, heavier than anything they had encountered so far. Not a demand. Not a warning. A request. Polite. Formal. Perfectly structured. Prell read it again. Slower this time. Ambassador vessel, he repeated. Ethrin felt something tighten in his chest. They're referring to us. Saran nodded. Yes. Not patrol ship. Not unidentified contact. Not potential threat. Ambassador vessel. They classified us as diplomatic, Prell said quietly. Ethrin's gaze remained fixed on the message. Before we even responded, Saran checked the transmission data. There's no skin leading into this. No active probing. Prell frowned. That's not possible. And yet, she said. Ethrin exhaled slowly. They knew we were here. Prell looked at him. For how long? No one answered. Because the answer was already there. Long enough. Long enough to prepare. Long enough to decide how to respond. Long enough to choose their words carefully. Ethrin read the message again. Every word precise. Every word intentional. Ambassador vessel detected. They weren't guessing. They weren't probing. They were stating. Please specify preferred rendezvous coordinates. Not. Come closer. Not. Identify yourselves. Not. Withdraw. They were asking. Giving control. Offering choice. Saran's voice was quieter now. They're letting us decide how this goes. Prell shook his head slightly. No. Ethrin glanced at him. No. Prell's eyes remained on the message. They've already decided. Ethrin understood immediately. This wasn't negotiation. This wasn't uncertainty. This was confidence. They weren't asking because they needed guidance. They were asking because they didn't need to force anything. Ethrin felt the shift fully now. From anomaly, to presence, to intelligence, to intent. And none of it had been aggressive. Commander, Saran said carefully, what are your orders? Ethrin didn't answer immediately, because for the first time since the encounter began, he wasn't responding to something unknown. He was responding to someone, and that required a different kind of thinking. Prell spoke softly. The language. Ethrin glanced at him. What about it? It's perfect, Prell said. Not translated. Not approximate. Exact Dominion diplomatic syntax. Saran nodded. No accent markers. No structural deviations. Ethrin looked back at the message. They've studied us. Prell gave a small, tight nod. For a long time. That realization landed harder than anything else so far. Because it meant, while the Dominion had ignored humanity, humanity had been watching, learning, preparing. Ethrin stepped closer to the display. They waited 6 hours, he said quietly. Saran blinked. What? They arrived. They held position. They made no move, no signal, no scan. He looked at the message again. Then they spoke. Prell's voice dropped. After we understood what we were looking at. Ethrin nodded once. Yes. Timing. Deliberate. Measured. They had waited. Until the Dominion realized. Only then did they respond. Saran swallowed. That's not caution. Prell shook his head. No. Ethrin finished the thought. That's control. Silence again. The message remained on the screen. Unchanged. Patient. Waiting. Just like the ship. Ethrin straightened slightly. Prepare a response. Saran hesitated. What do we say? That was the question. Not tactical. Not technical. Diplomatic. Ethrin considered it carefully. Every word mattered now. Because whatever he sent would define the next step. Prell spoke quietly. They already know who we are. Ethrin nodded. Yes. They already know we'll respond. Yes. They already know we're outmatched. Ethrin didn't respond to that. Because it didn't need to be said. It was already understood. He looked at the message one more time. At the tone. At the structure. At the complete absence of threat. And then, he made his decision. Open channel, he said. Saran nodded, routing the connection. Channel open. Ethrin took a breath. Not to steady himself. To choose precision. Unidentified vessel. He began, then stopped. No, that was wrong. They weren't unidentified. They had already introduced themselves. Without saying who they were. He adjusted. Contact acknowledged. Dominion patrol vessel present at boundary. Requesting identification and intent. Saran transmitted the message. The response came in less than 4 minutes. Faster than expected. Slower than reflex. Deliberate. The new message appeared on the screen. Admiral Ethrin, this is Captain Yara Okoye of the UHS Resolute Dawn. We are prepared to receive you aboard at any time. We have accommodations ready. We look forward to the conversation. The room went completely still. Prell read it once. Then again. They named you. Ethrin didn't move. Yes. Saran's voice was almost a whisper. They knew your rank, your name. Prell's grip tightened slightly. They've had access to our systems. Or our transmissions. Ethrin's mind was already moving past that. To something else. Something more important. We are prepared to receive you aboard. Not. We will come to you. Not. Remain where you are. They were inviting him. Onto their ship. We have accommodations ready. Prell exhaled slowly. They expected this. Not hoped. Not planned as a possibility. Expected. Ethrin looked at the final line. We look forward to the conversation. Not negotiation. Not discussion. Conversation. Like this was something long overdue. Like this was something inevitable. Saran finally found her voice. Commander, what do we do? Ethrin didn't answer immediately. Because the situation had changed completely. This wasn't a standoff. It wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't even a first contact. Not really. This was something else. Something that had been building for a long time. Without them realizing. He looked at the ship again. At the lights. At the silent, massive presence of it. At the control. The patience. The precision. And he understood something clearly. This entire encounter had not been about power. It had been about readiness. And humanity was ready. Ethrin straightened slightly. Prepare a shuttle. Saran's eyes widened. Commander? Prell looked at him. You're going? Ethrin met his gaze. Yes. There was no hesitation in his voice now. Because the decision had already been made. The moment the message arrived. They invited us, he said. Prell hesitated. And if this is a trap? Ethrin looked back at the ship. At the scale. At the silence. At everything they had already seen. If it was, he said calmly. We wouldn't still be here. Silence followed that. Because it was true. Uncomfortably true. Saran nodded slowly. I'll prepare the shuttle. Ethrin gave a single nod. Then turned his attention back to the display. To the message. To the ship. To the quiet certainty of what was about to happen. The unknown was gone. Replaced by something far more complex. They weren't dealing with an anomaly anymore. They weren't even dealing with a threat. They were dealing with a civilization that had spent 80 years preparing for this moment. And now, they were finally ready to talk. The shuttle crossed the distance in silence. No escort. No interference. No guidance. The coordinates had been transmitted, but nothing adjusted their trajectory. No tractor fields. No docking signals beyond a simple, passive beacon. It was as if the massive vessel ahead didn't need to manage their arrival. As if it trusted them to reach it. or knew they would. Ethrin sat in the forward seat, watching. He had chosen not to rely on sensor overlays. Not this time. Numbers had already failed to prepare him. He wanted to see it. Unfiltered. The human vessel grew in the viewport slowly at first. Then too quickly, perspective collapsed under its scale. What had once been an absence in the stars now became structure. Edges. Depth. Mass. The surface wasn't smooth. It wasn't clean. It wasn't even consistent. It was layered. Plates over plates. Each one thick enough to be its own hull, arranged in overlapping formations that suggested not elegance, but endurance. Light traced along those layers in long, measured lines. Running lights. Position markers. Not decorative. Functional. Everything about the ship felt like that. Not designed to impress. Designed to survive. The shuttle continued forward, and the vessel kept growing, until it stopped feeling like an object, and started feeling like an environment. They weren't approaching a ship. They were approaching something that contained ships. Distance to docking vector? Ethrin asked. The pilot swallowed slightly. Adjusting. The answer wasn't precise. Because precision didn't seem to apply anymore. The docking bay appeared gradually, not because it opened, but because they came close enough to recognize it. A recessed section in the hull. Vast. Structured. Large enough to hold multiple Dominion frigates side by side. The shuttle entered without resistance. No shields. No barriers. No weapons tracking. Just open space. Waiting. They touched down in one corner of the bay. Ethrin stood before the landing ramp, lowered completely. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate. He stepped forward. The air was stable. Gravity consistent. Everything controlled. At the base of the ramp, someone was waiting. She stood alone. Not armored. Not surrounded by guards. Not elevated above them. Just present. Admiral Ethrin, she said. Her voice was calm. Precise. Unaccented. Captain Yara Okoye. Welcome aboard the Resolute Dawn. Ethrin studied her for a moment. She didn't match the expectation his mind had built. No imposing presence. No overt display of authority. Just stillness. Confidence. And something else. Ease. Captain, he said. She inclined her head slightly. Thank you for coming. Not. Thank you for accepting the invitation. Thank you for coming. As if this was something already decided. Ethrin nodded once. You expected us. Yes. No hesitation. No attempt to soften it. Just truth. She turned slightly. I thought it would be useful to show you around before we talk. Ethrin glanced at Prell behind him. Then back to her. A tour. Yes. She said it like it was obvious. Like it was the correct sequence of events. Ethrin considered that for a brief moment. Then nodded. Very well. She led them forward. The first thing Ethrin noticed was space. The corridors were wide. Wider than necessary. Wider than efficient. Dominion vessels were designed for optimization. Minimal excess. Maximum function. These corridors weren't optimized. They were prepared. Prepared for movement under stress. For groups. For obstruction. For damage. The overhead clearance was higher than required. The lighting came from multiple independent sources. Every section had redundancy. Every section assumed failure. Prell walked behind them. Quiet. Absorbing everything. His eyes moved constantly. Cataloging. Comparing. Trying to understand. Ethrin said nothing. He didn't need to. The design spoke for itself. They passed a station embedded directly into the wall. Fully stocked. Clearly marked. Accessible from any direction. What is that? Ethrin asked. Damage control point, Okoye replied. One of many. How many? One every 40 meters. Ethrin paused slightly. That's excessive. Okoye glanced at him. No, she said calmly. It's immediate. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The implication was clear. Damage wasn't hypothetical here. It was expected. They continued. The armor section came next. A transparent corridor ran alongside a cross-section of the hull. Ethrin stopped. Not because he chose to. Because he had to. The layers were visible. Clearly. Distinctly. One after another. Thick. Dense. Separated by structured gaps. Shock absorption. Energy dissipation. Each layer designed to fail. So the next one could hold. How many? Ethrin asked. 9, Okoye said. Ethrin didn't respond immediately. 9. Dominion warships used 2. 3 at most with reinforcement. 9. Wasn't design. It was doctrine. The outer layers, he said slowly. They're sacrificial. Yes. The inner layers? Preserve function. She looked at the structure as she spoke. Not proudly, not defensively, just factually. We expect to take damage, she said. Ethrin turned slightly. To that extent. Okoye met his gaze. To every extent. Silence followed. Because that wasn't strategy. That was mindset. They moved on. The engine section wasn't a room. It was a space. A massive internal structure that existed within the ship rather than being part of it. 8 drive systems. Not aligned. Not symmetrical. Placed in positions that didn't make sense. Until you stopped thinking in terms of efficiency and started thinking in terms of survival. Why this configuration? Ethrin asked. So we never lose movement entirely, Okoye replied. If one section is destroyed, others compensate. Prell stepped forward slightly. Each system uses a different principle, he said. Okoye looked at him. A small shift in her expression. Recognition. Yes. Prell nodded slowly. So no single countermeasure disables propulsion. Yes. Ethrin looked at the drives again. 8 systems. 8 methods. All active. All ready. This wasn't redundancy. Redundancy was backup. This was something else. Preparation beyond expectation. They moved again. The medical section. Segmented. Compartmentalized. Each cluster isolated. Independent power. Independent life support. If one section is lost, Okoye said, the others continue. Ethrin looked at the layout. At the distribution. At the planning behind it. You built this expecting casualties. Okoye didn't hesitate. Yes. Not reluctantly. Not defensively. Just. Yes. They continued to the weapons deck. Ethrin noticed immediately. There was no standardization. Different systems. Different scales. Different placements. Some visible. Some embedded. Some integrated into structural elements that didn't look like weapons until you knew what to look for. You use multiple weapon types, he said. Yes. Why not standardize? Okoye tilted her head slightly. Because we don't know what we'll face. Ethrin paused. That's inefficient. It's flexible. Their eyes met briefly. And in that moment, Ethrin understood something. The Dominion built for known threats. Humans built for unknown ones. That difference explained everything. He stopped counting the weapon placements. Because the number stopped being useful. Finally, they reached the bridge. It was calm. Ordered. Controlled. Not tense. Not reactive. The crew worked with quiet precision. No urgency. No fear. Just awareness. The main display showed the Dominion ships outside. Small. Distant. Contained. Okoye stood beside him. You've seen most of it, she said. Ethrin nodded slowly. Yes. You have questions? Yes. There were many. Too many. Tactical. Strategic. Diplomatic. But none of those came first. Because one question had been building since the moment he saw the hull. Since the moment he understood the layers. The drives. The crew. Everything. He turned to her. This ship, he said. The design. The redundancy. The scale. He paused. Then, you built all of this expecting the worst. Okoye didn't interrupt. You planned for catastrophic damage. System failure. Mass casualties. Ethrin held her gaze. Why? For the first time. She didn't answer immediately. The bridge remained quiet around them. The stars steady beyond the viewport. Then, she spoke. 80 years ago, she said, a ship came to our system. Ethrin felt something shift. They observed us. She continued. They cataloged us. Her voice didn't change. They left. No accusation. No anger. Just fact. They didn't explain why. Ethrin said nothing. They didn't communicate intent. She looked at him. They didn't tell us if they would come back. Silence. The weight of it settled slowly. We knew you existed, she said. We knew you were more advanced. Her gaze didn't waver. We didn't know why you came. Ethrin felt it then. The shift. The perspective. And we didn't know what would happen when you returned. The words were simple, but the meaning behind them was not. So we prepared. Not for war. Not for conquest. For uncertainty. Every layer. Every system. Every redundancy. Every decision. All of it. Answered one question. What do you do when you don't know why something stronger than you came? And left without explanation? Ethrin didn't speak. Because there was nothing to say. The answer stood around him. In steel. In systems. In design. In philosophy. And for the first time, he understood. This wasn't excess. This wasn't over-engineering. This wasn't fear in the way the Dominion defined it. This was something else. Something deeper. Something more human. Preparation. For every possibility. Even the ones they hoped would never come. Okoye turned slightly toward the viewport. "We didn't build this to fight you," she said. Ethrin's voice was quiet. "But you built it in case you had to." She looked at him again. Yes. No hesitation. No denial. Just truth. And somehow, that was more unsettling than anything else he had seen. The conversation did not end on the bridge. It didn't end anywhere, not really. Because what had begun between them was not a negotiation, not a confrontation, not even a formal exchange. It was an understanding. One that neither side had been prepared for in the way they expected. Ethrin stood alone in the guest quarters later. The room was quiet. Deliberately so. Minimal design, but not sparse. Functional, but not cold. Everything placed with intent. Nothing excessive, nothing ornamental. Like the ship itself. Through the viewport, the hull curved upward and outward, vast enough that it blocked most of the stars. Only narrow sections of space were visible between structural ridges, like fragments of a sky broken into pieces. He had seen warships before. Thousands of them. He had studied them, commanded them, assessed them. He knew what power looked like. This was not what he expected, because the power here wasn't in weapons. It wasn't in aggression. It wasn't even in scale, though the scale was undeniable. It was in something else. Something quieter. Something that didn't announce itself, but endured. He opened his log. The interface flickered to life, waiting. For 30 years, he had written reports the same way. Structured, precise, efficient, threat classification, capability summary, recommended response. Everything reduced to something manageable, something actionable. He stared at the empty field for a long moment. Then began. Contact with Terran vessel confirmed. He paused. That was already wrong. This wasn't just contact. He erased the line. Tried again. Encounter with Terran fleet asset at boundary. No. Too clinical. Too detached. He deleted it again. His fingers hovered over the interface. For the first time in his career, he didn't have the right framework, because nothing he had seen fit into the old ones. He thought about the hull. 9 layers. Each one designed to fail so the next could hold. He thought about the drives. 8 systems, each different, each ready. He thought about the crew. 6,000 lives, not optimized for efficiency, but for survival. He thought about the weapons. Not standardized. Not streamlined. Flexible. Prepared. He thought about the corridors. Wide enough to move through destruction. The damage control points. Always within reach. The medical bays. Built with the expectation that parts of them would be gone. And then, he thought about the reason. Not war. Not conquest. Not ambition. Uncertainty. He exhaled slowly. And began again. Assessment category requires revision. He stopped. Read the line. Left it. Because it was the only thing that felt accurate. Everything else was still forming. He leaned back slightly. The quiet of the room pressed in around him. Not empty. Not passive. Just present. Like the ship. Like the people who built it. He closed his eyes for a moment. And saw it again. The first report. 80 years ago. A small system. A primitive species. No threat. Monitoring interval. 200 years. Clean. Simple. Wrong. He understood now. What they had missed. Not capability. Not even trajectory. Something more fundamental. They had measured what humanity was. They had not asked what humanity would do. Once it knew something greater existed. Once it knew it had been seen. Judged. Left. He opened his eyes. And spoke quietly, not to the log, but to himself. We didn't scare them. The thought finished on its own. We gave them a reason. A reason to prepare. A reason to build. A reason to make sure that whatever came next, they would be ready for it. No matter what it was. No matter how unlikely. No matter how extreme. He stood and moved closer to the viewport. The ship stretched endlessly around him. Layered. Solid. Unyielding. And yet, it had not moved. It had not threatened. It had not demanded. It had waited. Patiently. Calmly. Confidently. For them. That was the part that lingered. Not the strength. Not the scale. The patience. Because patience like that didn't come from fear. It came from certainty. Certainty that they had done everything they could. Prepared for everything they could imagine. And whatever happened next, they would face it. Ethrin understood something then. Something that shifted the entire frame of the situation. He had come here to determine whether humanity was a threat. That had been the question. The wrong question. Because threat implied intention. Aggression. Direction. What he had seen was something else entirely. Humanity was not a threat. Humanity was a response to the unknown, to uncertainty, to the silence of something more powerful watching them, and not explaining why. He returned to the log, added one more line. We assessed their capability. We failed to assess their motivation. He paused, then added, they were not hiding. Another pause. We were not watching. The words settled. Simple. Accurate. Damning. He closed the log. Transmission would come later, when he had the language, when the Dominion had the framework to understand it. If it ever did. Outside, the stars remained distant and cold. The Dominion fleet held position far beyond the hull, small points of ordered light against the vastness. Contained, measured, predictable. And here, inside this ship, was something else. Not chaotic, not uncontrolled, but built with a different philosophy. Not minimal, not efficient, thorough, complete, ready. Ethrin rested his hand lightly against the surface of the viewport. Cold, solid, real. He thought about the question he had asked. What were you expecting? And the answer, we didn't know why. That was it. That was everything. Not knowing why something stronger than you exists, and what it might do. So you prepare for everything. He looked out at the stars again, at the narrow gaps between the hull where light still reached him. And for the first time, he understood what humanity had built. Not just a ship, not just a weapon, a solution to uncertainty, a solution to fear that didn't rely on removing it, but on being ready for it. He exhaled slowly, and in that moment, the final realization settled completely. The Dominion had spent 80 years not thinking about humanity. Humanity had spent 80 years thinking about the Dominion. And the difference between those two things now filled the space between them. The ship remained where it was. Silent, massive, patient, waiting, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as an answer. And Ethrin finally understood what that answer meant. They hadn't built it to conquer. They hadn't built it to attack. They had built it so that whatever came next, they would never be unprepared again.